Margaret Reynolds sat in her favorite armchair, staring out the window as the autumn leaves drifted to the ground. The house was quiet, but her mind wasn't. She had spent her entire life building this family, pouring her love, time, and sacrifices into her 3 children. She had never asked for much in return, just to see them happy. To know that they loved her as much as she loved them. But tonight, she wasn't so sure. It had started subtly. A comment here, a question there. "Mom, have you thought about getting your will in order?" David had asked over dinner, swirling his wine like it was just casual conversation. "Are you planning to keep the house? It might be too much for you now." Lisa had chimed in, her voice sweet but her eyes sharp. Even Mark, the quietest of the 3, had been making calls to their family lawyer behind her back. Margaret had dismissed it at first. Maybe they were just concerned about her well-being, about what would happen when she was gone. But then she overheard the conversation that changed everything. She had been walking down the hallway when she heard their voices, David and Lisa, talking in hushed tones. "She has to leave everything to us. It's only fair, of course, but we need to make sure Mark doesn't get more than he deserves. You know how Mom is. She thinks we all should be equal." "Yeah, well, let's hope she doesn't get any stupid ideas about charities or whatever. We need to get her to finalize everything soon." Margaret froze. The blood drained from her face as reality sank in. They weren't worried about her. They weren't worried about her health, her happiness, or the time she had left. They were worried about her money. Her hands trembled as she clutched the staircase railing, her heart aching in a way she never thought possible. Her children, the people she had raised, loved, and sacrificed for, weren't even waiting for her to be gone before fighting over her inheritance. She turned away, walking back to her room in silence. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, one thought echoed in her mind. If this is what they care about most, then maybe they don't deserve it at all. Margaret sat at the head of the dining table, watching her children with newfound clarity. For years, she had seen them as her pride and joy. The reason she had worked so hard, saved so carefully, built a life that would secure their futures. But now, as they smiled at her across the table, their voices filled with false warmth, she saw them for what they really were, not loving children, but competitors, circling their prize, her prize. The meal was almost finished when she decided to test them. She placed her napkin down carefully, looked around the table, and spoke in a calm, measured voice. "I had a meeting with my doctor this week. That got their attention." David set down his fork. Lisa leaned in. Mark glanced up from his phone. "He says I may not be able to live on my own much longer." She sighed dramatically. "Which means I need to start thinking about what comes next." Lisa reached for her hand, her expression full of forced sympathy. "Oh, Mom, we just want you to be comfortable." David nodded, his tone too eager. "Of course, if you need to move somewhere more manageable, we can figure that out." Mark, ever the practical one, went straight to the point. "Are you thinking of selling the house?" Margaret studied them carefully, her next words a calculated strike. "Yes. The doctor suggested that I sell the house and use the money to move into a retirement community." She paused. "I think it's a good idea." Silence. The warmth drained from their faces. David was the first to speak, his voice a little too sharp. "Mom, that house has been in our family for years." Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. "Are you sure that's necessary? I mean, you still have time to think about it, right?" Mark exhaled, shaking his head. "Honestly, Mom, that seems like a waste. Selling the house now? Just to throw all that money into a retirement home?" There it was. Not a single one of them had asked if she was okay. Not one had said they'd take care of her, no matter what. All they cared about was what they stood to lose. Margaret took a slow sip of her tea, hiding her disappointment behind the rim of her cup. She had her answer. They weren't worried about her well-being. They were worried about the money. And at that moment, Margaret knew exactly what she had to do. The next morning, Margaret made 2 phone calls. The first was to her lawyer. "I need to make changes to my will," she said, her voice steady. The second was to her real estate agent. "Sell the house," she instructed, "as soon as possible." She could almost hear the shock in the agent's voice. Are you sure, Mrs. Reynolds? This is a beautiful home. I'm sure. That evening, Margaret sat in her study, calmly drafting her final decisions. She rewrote her will. Not a single penny would go to David, Lisa, or Mark. Instead, she arranged for her wealth to be donated to charities that truly mattered. A foundation that provided education grants for underprivileged students. A shelter for single mothers escaping abusive relationships. A retirement home that supported elderly individuals with no family to care for them. The house, the same one her children had fought over like hungry wolves, was to be sold. The money? Divided among causes that would actually appreciate it. Her children had expected riches. Instead, they would get nothing. And Margaret? She had never felt lighter. By the time the papers were signed and everything was finalized, Margaret called her lawyer one last time. Make sure the will is ironclad. I don't want them contesting a single thing. The lawyer chuckled. Don't worry, Mrs. Reynolds. Once they find out, they'll try, but they won't win. Margaret smiled to herself. Her children thought they had time. They thought they could manipulate her, push her into decisions that benefited them. But now, they had no idea what was coming. The day Margaret's children learned the truth was a day she would never forget. David, Lisa, and Mark arrived at her house, expecting their usual Sunday lunch. They walked in, chatting, completely unaware that everything had changed. Margaret sat at the dining table, waiting. In front of her were 3 envelopes. One for each of them. She gestured for them to sit. I have something important to discuss with you all, she said calmly. Lisa's eyes flickered with curiosity. Is this about the house? Mom? David leaned forward, his expression sharp. Did you make a decision? Margaret slid the envelopes toward them. Yes, I did. The room fell silent as they tore them open, their eyes scanning the contents. And then, chaos. David was the first to react. His face turned red, his voice rising in disbelief. What the hell is this? Lisa gasped, clutching the paper as if she had misread it. Mom, tell me this is a joke. Mark, usually the quiet one, slammed his hand on the table. You gave it all away? To strangers? Margaret met their outraged, betrayed expressions with a calm smile. Not strangers, she corrected. To people who actually need it. David shook his head, laughing bitterly. So you're punishing us? For what? Wanting what's ours? Margaret tilted her head. Tell me, David, at what point did my money become something you were entitled to? Lisa's eyes filled with tears. But Margaret saw them for what they were, tears of loss. Not love. Mom, we're your family, she pleaded. How could you do this to us? Margaret leaned forward, her voice gentle but unwavering. Family, she echoed. Family isn't about blood, Lisa. It's about love, respect, and support. Tell me, when was the last time any of you asked how I was feeling? What I needed? Silence. They couldn't answer, because the truth was they had never cared about her, only about what she could give them. Mark exhaled sharply, his hands clenched. This isn't fair. Margaret chuckled. No, Mark. What wasn't fair was watching my own children see me as nothing more than a check waiting to be signed. David stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. You'll regret this, Mom. Margaret smiled. No, David, I think for the first time in my life, I won't. As her children stormed out, Margaret sat back, a strange sense of peace washing over her. They had just lost everything they thought mattered. And she had finally set herself free. The house was empty now. Not in a lonely way, but in a liberating way. Margaret stood in the foyer, running her fingers along the polished wooden staircase one last time. This house had been filled with memories, laughter, and love. It had also been tainted by greed, entitlement, and disappointment. And now, it was no longer a battleground. It was just a house. A week after her children walked out of her life, the sale was finalized. Every dollar from it was already on its way to the causes she had carefully chosen, charities that would actually change lives. The day the sale closed, Margaret received one last call from David. She debated answering, but curiosity won. Mom. His voice was tight, restrained, holding back anger. David. A pause. Then, are you really doing this? Already done. She could hear his sharp breath on the other end. Frustration. Powerlessness. You could have left us something. Margaret smiled. I did. What? A lesson. There was nothing left to say. She ended the call. Margaret never heard from them again. And she never regretted it. Months later, she sat at a community center, watching a young woman sign her first college scholarship, funded by the money her children thought they were entitled to. The girl looked up, beaming. Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds. This means everything to me. Margaret squeezed her hand, her heart full for the first time in years. You earned it, sweetheart. Her children lost millions, but Margaret? She won something far greater. She had ensured her legacy wasn't greed, but generosity. And that was the real inheritance. This story isn't just about money, it's about values, love, and the true meaning of family. Margaret saw through the greed of her children and chose to leave behind something far more powerful than wealth, a legacy of kindness. Instead of letting her fortune divide them, she gave it to those who truly needed it, proving that riches don't define a person, but their choices do. What do you think? Was Margaret right to give it all away? Comment 2 if you loved her decision, or 7 if you think she should have handled it differently, and if you believe that true wealth is about more than just money. Hit the like button and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Let's talk in the comments.